Jonathan Roumie broke down in tears before Keanu Reeves even finished his sentence. The man who plays Jesus couldn't stop shaking. And Keanu, he wasn't there to act. He was there to confess. The studio fell silent, not for drama, but because something holy had entered the room. Where are you watching from? Because what came next made even the cameras forget they were rolling. Keanu didn't just speak about God. He brought him into the room with a story no script could write, and a pain only resurrection could explain. There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew about yourself, about reality, about the very fabric of existence, suddenly shifts. For Keanu Reeves, that moment came on a quiet night in Berlin, in a hotel room that felt more like a sanctuary than a temporary shelter. The atmosphere that evening was haunting in its stillness, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Moonlight filtered weakly through heavy curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. The room felt alive somehow, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with electricity or the hum of city life below. It was the kind of presence that settles into your bones before your mind can even process what's happening. Keanu had been wrestling with exhaustion. Days of intense filming had left him mentally drained, his body aching from the physical demands of his craft. But this wasn't just physical tiredness. This was the deep, soul-crushing weariness that comes from carrying grief like a stone in your chest for years. The kind of burden that makes you question everything, especially when you're alone with your thoughts in a foreign city, thousands of miles from anything familiar. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair, when something extraordinary began to unfold. A light appeared, but not from any lamp or window. This wasn't the harsh fluorescence of hotel lighting or the gentle glow of streetlights creeping through curtains. This was something else entirely, a presence that seemed to emanate warmth and understanding, wrapping around him like an embrace from someone who knew every scar, every secret, every moment of pain he'd carried. At first, doubt crept in. His rational mind kicked into overdrive, searching for explanations. Was this exhaustion playing tricks on him? Was his grief finally manifesting in hallucinations? He'd been through so much loss, so much heartbreak, that maybe his mind was simply cracking under the weight of it all. But as the presence grew stronger, more tangible, he realized this wasn't his imagination creating comfort. This was something real, something beyond his understanding, reaching out to him in his darkest hour. The losses had been devastating. His daughter Ava, taken before she could even draw her first breath. River Phoenix, his dear friend, gone too young in a spiral of self-destruction that left everyone who loved him reeling. Jennifer Syme, the woman who shared his grief over their lost child, also taken in a cruel twist of fate that seemed to mock any belief in cosmic justice. Each loss had built walls around his heart, walls he thought were protecting him, keeping him safe from further pain. But these walls had become a prison, locking him away from connection, from hope, from the very possibility that life could hold meaning beyond suffering. In that Berlin hotel room, those walls began to crack. The light that surrounded him didn't erase the darkness of his experiences. It didn't minimize his pain or pretend his losses weren't profound. Instead, it illuminated that darkness, cast it in a new perspective, as if to say that his suffering wasn't meaningless, that every tear shed, every sleepless night, every moment of wondering why tragedy seemed to follow him like a shadow, all of it had purpose in some grand design he couldn't fully comprehend. The light spoke to him without words, communicated in a language deeper than sound. It acknowledged every broken dream, every shattered hope, and somehow transformed them into something sacred. His pain became not just personal anguish, but a bridge to understanding the pain of others. His losses became not just endings, but preparation for a different kind of beginning, drawn by an impulse he couldn't explain. Keanu reached for the leather-bound Bible his grandfather had given him years ago. It had traveled with him through countless film sets, hotel rooms, and apartments, always present but rarely opened. His grandfather's faith had been quiet but unshakable, a steady lighthouse in a family that had known its share of storms. Tonight, that faith seemed to reach across the years, guiding Keanu's hands as he opened the worn pages. The book fell open to John chapter 11, and his eyes found words that seemed to leap off the page with electric intensity. "I am the resurrection and the life." The simple statement hit him with the force of revelation. This wasn't just ancient text or religious doctrine. This was a promise, a declaration that death, loss, and endings weren't the final word in his story, or in anyone's story. In that moment, everything he'd lost, everyone he'd loved and buried, felt present again, not in the desperate, grasping way of someone trying to hold on to ghosts, but in the peaceful certainty that love transcends physical existence, that the connections we forge, the impact we have on each other, these things echo beyond the grave. His daughter, his friend, his love, they weren't truly gone. They were part of something larger, something eternal, something that this mysterious presence was inviting him to glimpse. The transformation wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There were no thunderclaps or heavenly choirs. Instead, it was like watching sunrise after the longest night of winter. Gradual, gentle, but absolutely undeniable. The same man who had entered that hotel room emerged, but with something fundamental shifted in his core. The weight of grief was still there, but it no longer felt like chains. It felt like depth, like the kind of profound understanding that only comes through walking through fire and discovering you can survive the flames. Have you ever experienced a moment when your deepest pain suddenly revealed itself as a doorway to something greater? When the very thing that nearly destroyed you became the foundation for a strength you never knew you possessed? These moments are rare and precious, often arriving when we least expect them, in places we never thought to look for meaning. For Keanu, this wasn't just a personal revelation. It was a responsibility. The truth of what he'd experienced felt too significant to keep locked away in his heart. Despite his natural inclination toward privacy, despite knowing that sharing something so intimate would invite scrutiny and perhaps skepticism, he felt compelled to speak. Some truths are too important to remain hidden, too transformative to keep to ourselves. This realization would eventually lead him to sit across from Jonathan Roumie, ready to share not just the facts of his experience, but the profound shift it created in his understanding of life, death, and everything that gives existence meaning. The conversation that followed would reveal layers of wisdom earned through suffering, hope discovered in despair, and faith found in the most unexpected places. The studio felt sacred in its simplicity. 2 chairs, warm lighting that cast gentle shadows, and an atmosphere thick with anticipation. When Keanu Reeves walked in to meet Jonathan Roumie, there was something different about him. The man who had captivated audiences as Neo, who had embodied vengeance as John Wick, carried himself with a quieter strength now. His eyes held depths that spoke of recent transformation, of truths discovered in unexpected places. Jonathan watched him settle into the chair across from him, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with portraying Jesus Christ in The Chosen. But today, he sensed he was about to witness something that transcended performance, something that would challenge his own understanding of faith and suffering. The air between them hummed with unspoken recognition. 2 souls who had wrestled with purpose and found themselves forever changed by the encounter. Keanu's voice for him when he began to speak carried the careful cadence of someone who had learned that words have power beyond their surface meaning. He spoke of that night in Berlin, and Jonathan found himself leaning forward, drawn not just by the story, but by the profound shift he could see in the man telling it. This wasn't just another celebrity sharing a spiritual experience. This was a human being who had been broken open and rebuilt by something larger than himself. The conversation took on a rhythm all its own, like a dance between 2 people who understood that some truths can only be approached sideways, through metaphor and shared experience. When Keanu described the light that had surrounded him, Jonathan felt an echo of recognition. Playing Jesus had taught him about the thin places between heaven and earth, the moments when the divine breaks through the mundane in ways that defy explanation. Jonathan's own journey had been marked by fear and wonder in equal measure. Taking on the role of Christ had felt like standing at the edge of an infinite ocean. Knowing he was about to dive into waters deeper than his understanding, he had wrestled with his own inadequacy, wondering how someone as flawed and human as himself could possibly embody the perfect love he was called to portray. But listening to Keanu, he realized that perhaps that very inadequacy had been the point. Perhaps it was in their brokenness that they became vessels for something greater. The conversation turned to the moment that had shattered Keanu's understanding of grief. He spoke of reading about Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus, and his words painted a picture that transcended the familiar Sunday school story. In Keanu's telling, Jesus became not a distant figure performing miracles, but a friend who chose to enter fully into human sorrow. The tears weren't weakness. They were solidarity. They were the conscious decision of infinite love to experience finite pain. Keanu's voice grew soft as he described his realization. He could see Jesus standing there, tears streaming down his face, not because he lacked the power to overcome death, but because he chose to feel the full weight of what death meant to those who loved Lazarus. In that moment, Keanu understood that his own tears, his own anguish over the losses that had marked his life, weren't signs of abandonment by the divine. They were invitations into deeper communion with a God who wept alongside him. The studio fell silent except for the gentle sound of Keanu's breathing, which seemed to harmonize with the sacred space they had created together. Jonathan felt the presence of something holy in that quietness, something that transformed their conversation from interview to prayer without either of them speaking the word. Then Keanu made a connection that sent chills through Jonathan's spine. He spoke of his iconic roles, of Neo discovering his true identity, of John Wick rising from apparent death to seek justice. What if, Keanu wondered aloud, these weren't just fictional stories he had been chosen to tell? What if there was something prophetic in the way his career had been shaped, preparing him to understand resurrection not as special effects, but as spiritual reality? The thought hung in the air between them, electric with possibility. Neo's awakening in the Matrix, his ability to see beyond the illusion of what appeared to be real, John Wick's refusal to stay buried, his return from grief-induced numbness to purposeful action. These narratives that had defined Keanu's career suddenly took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his Berlin experience. But it was when the conversation turned to forgiveness that the real transformation became visible. Keanu spoke of his father with a voice that carried both pain and peace. The abandonment he had experienced as a child had carved out spaces in his heart that he had filled with walls and defenses. For decades, he had carried that wound like armor, using it to justify his emotional distance, his reluctance to fully trust. Then he had encountered the words of Jesus on the cross, asking forgiveness for those who were destroying him. The radical nature of that forgiveness, offered not because the perpetrators deserved it, but because love demanded it, had begun to dissolve the armor Keanu had worn for so long. He described the sensation as both terrifying and liberating, like shedding a skin he hadn't realized was suffocating him. Jonathan watched this vulnerable sharing with growing awe. When he had stepped into the role of Jesus, he had feared his own limitations would diminish the character. But here was living proof that the message he was helping to bring to screen had real power in real lives. Keanu's transformation wasn't happening because of perfect theology or flawless faith. It was happening because he had encountered love in its most raw and authentic form. The forgiveness Keanu described wasn't the easy kind that comes when someone apologizes and makes amends. This was the costly forgiveness that must be chosen again and again, the kind that transforms the forgiver as much as it releases the forgiven. He spoke of feeling lighter, not because his father's abandonment no longer mattered, but because he no longer had to carry the weight of resentment alongside the weight of loss. As their conversation drew toward its natural conclusion, Jonathan felt compelled to name what he was witnessing. Keanu's story wasn't just personal testimony, it was a living demonstration of the very message that The Chosen sought to convey. That the stories of faith aren't ancient history but present reality. That the God who walked with broken people 2,000 years ago still walks with broken people today. The suffering that had nearly destroyed Keanu had become the very thing that opened him to transcendence. His losses had created space for a kind of love he couldn't have understood without them. His pain had become not an obstacle to faith, but a doorway into deeper truth about the nature of divine love. In the quiet that followed, both men seemed to understand that they had participated in something larger than themselves. The conversation had become a bridge between Keanu's private transformation and the public ministry that The Chosen represented. His story of finding God in grief had become part of the larger story of hope that they were both called to tell. The transformation that began in a Berlin hotel room didn't end with personal revelation. True spiritual awakening, Keanu discovered, has a way of expanding beyond the boundaries of individual experience, reaching out like ripples in still water to touch lives in ways we never anticipate. What started as a private encounter with the divine began to reshape not just how he understood his own pain, but how he could use that understanding to meet others in theirs. The first test of his newfound perspective came sooner than expected. A phone call from a friend mentioned a children's hospital nearby, a place where families wrestled daily with questions that had no easy answers. Something in Keanu stirred, a recognition that his own journey through loss might have prepared him for moments like these. He found himself walking through sterile corridors that smelled of antiseptic and hope in equal measure, carrying with him not the burden of celebrity, but the quiet strength of someone who had learned that presence matters more than words. In the pediatric ward, he encountered a mother whose world had been turned upside down. Her daughter, no more than 7 years old, lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped with mechanical precision. The woman's eyes held the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone you might lose, from maintaining hope when everything around you suggests despair. When she looked up and saw Keanu approaching, there was a moment of confusion, then recognition, then something deeper than either. He pulled up a chair beside the bed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he understood that this space demanded reverence. The little girl's breathing was shallow but steady, her small hand resting on the white hospital blanket. Without fanfare or explanation, Keanu reached out and gently took the mother's hand, his touch communicating what words could not. In that simple gesture, he wasn't the action hero or the mysterious stranger from countless films. He was simply a father who had held his own child only in dreams, offering solidarity to another parent navigating the impossible terrain of loving someone whose future hung in the balance. The mother's tears came then, not from fresh grief, but from the relief of being understood without having to explain. When she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, she asked about Ava. Most people would have changed the subject, offered platitudes, or shared their own discomfort with such direct questions about loss. But Keanu's eyes brightened, not with pain but with recognition of connection. He spoke of his daughter not as a tragedy to be hidden, but as a love that transcended physical existence, a relationship that death could not diminish. In that hospital room, surrounded by the gentle hum of life-sustaining equipment and the soft rustle of nurses moving through their routines, something profound occurred. Keanu realized that the doors he had once thought were permanently closed by loss were actually opening onto pathways he had never imagined. Each experience of grief had created in him a capacity for compassion that could only be forged in the furnace of personal anguish. The very losses that had once isolated him now connected him to others in ways that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human interaction. This understanding began to reshape his entire approach to his craft and his life. The roles that had defined his career took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his spiritual awakening. Neo's journey from illusion to truth, John Wick's resurrection from grief-induced numbness. These weren't just fictional narratives anymore. They were preparation for a different kind of story, one where healing mattered more than revenge, where finding light was more important than fighting darkness. He began to envision a project that would reflect this transformation, a film that would explore themes of redemption and grace rather than vengeance and violence. The character he imagined wouldn't find resolution through conflict but through surrender, not by conquering enemies but by releasing the need for conquest altogether. It was a radical departure from the roles that had made him famous, but it felt like the most authentic expression of who he was becoming. The three questions that had haunted him through years of loss began to find their answers in unexpected places. Does love survive death walking through that hospital? Seeing parents whose love for their children burned brighter in the face of possible loss, he felt the resounding answer in his bones. Love wasn't diminished by death. It was purified by it, stripped of everything non-essential until only the eternal remained. Can meaning emerge from meaninglessness? Every conversation with grieving parents, every moment of connection born from shared suffering, confirmed that even the most senseless tragedies could become doorways to profound purpose. The randomness that had once tortured him began to look like preparation for service he couldn't have imagined in his younger years. Is there someone holding it all together? The presence he had encountered in Berlin seemed to follow him into these sacred spaces of suffering and healing, not as an abstract theological concept, but as a tangible reality that transformed ordinary moments into opportunities for transcendence. Whether others called it God, divine love, or simply the mysterious force that connects all living things, mattered less than the recognition that such a force existed and was actively engaged in the business of redemption. His faith, still tender and new, began to take on a universal quality that surprised him. While his encounter had been specifically with Jesus Christ, his understanding of that encounter expanded to embrace the possibility that the divine reveals itself in ways that transcend religious boundaries. The light that had embraced him in Berlin was the same light that shone in the eyes of every person who chose love over fear, connection over isolation, service over self-preservation. This revelation brought with it both comfort and responsibility. If the presence he had experienced was truly universal, then his story wasn't just his own. It was part of a larger narrative about the human capacity for transformation, about the way suffering can become a bridge rather than a wall. The privacy he had always treasured began to feel less like protection and more like withholding something that belonged to more than just himself. Standing in hospital corridors, sitting beside bedsides where families face their deepest fears, Keanu began to understand that his journey from personal darkness to spiritual light was meant to be shared, not as evangelism or conversion, but as testimony to the possibility that even the most devastating losses can become doorways to unexpected grace. The questions that had tormented him for years weren't unique to his experience. They were the universal human questions, the ones that every person who has ever loved and lost must eventually face. The chapter of his life defined by suffering wasn't ending, but it was being rewritten. The pain remained, but it no longer defined the story. Instead, it had become the foundation for a different kind of narrative, one where healing and hope were not just possible, but inevitable for those willing to walk through the darkness toward whatever light awaited on the other side. The journey that had begun with loss was becoming a path toward purpose he had never imagined possible. Keanu's story reminds us that suffering isn't the final punctuation mark in our lives, but rather a doorway leading to hope, meaning, and profound connection with others who share our human experience. I believe each of us carries within ourselves a story, a moment when our deepest pain cracked us open to reveal something infinitely more beautiful and purposeful than we ever imagined possible. His journey inspires me to look back at my own wounds with different eyes, to ask myself the question that might change everything. What is waiting for me on the other side of that door? What transformation lies hidden within the very experiences I've spent so much energy trying to forget or overcome? Your story matters too. Share it in the comments below and subscribe to Motivation for Success to discover more journeys that illuminate the path from darkness to light. Together, We can find hope in the shadows and help each other step through whatever doors are waiting to open in our lives.